so it will be available later on. It takes a little while for Zoom to get it uploaded. So once they get it uploaded, I'll download it. I'll then upload it to my YouTube page, and I'll post y'all a link to it so that you can go back and watch this again if you want to at some other time. Also for anybody that didn't get there. We ended up doing it this way, which I should have known. If I said, hey, we're not going to hold class in person because it's going to take me forever to get there, then because there might be fog, then there wouldn't be any fog. So it was a beautiful morning, no fog, thankfully. So, but I wasn't going to email y'all at the last minute and say, hey, no, we are having class. So hopefully this will be a one-time thing. We won't have to do it this way again. I forgot how much I absolutely despise this. If I had to do it, I would, but if I don't have to do it, I'm definitely not going to do it this way. Just because I hate the not having any interaction. That being said, just a little refresher, and to kind of touch base and tell you how I like to run my Zoom classes. I don't use the chat feature. Okay, so if you type something in the chat, I'm not likely to see it. I find it distracting that I have to jump to the chat and read it while I'm trying to lecture. So if you have a question, or if you want to make a comment, or if you want to stop me or something like that, you don't have to raise your hand. You don't have to do anything like that with the little features. Just unmute yourself and just ask a question. All right. Easiest way to unmute yourself if you're using a desktop or a laptop, if you did not know this, is to hold down the space bar. All right. That will temporarily unmute you while you have it held down. And then when you let go of it, you'll be back on mute. So you don't have to, try to find the mute button and click on it or whatever. You can just temporarily unmute yourself that way. If you're on an iPhone or an iPad or something like that, then you'll just have to click, on the audio button or something like that. But if you're using a desktop or laptop, it's really easy. We will review on Tuesday, so don't forget that. Come with questions prepared, topics to discuss, whatever. Thursday will be our exam 4. Make sure you have a Scantron. If you don't have one already, grab one. Have that available when you come to class on Thursday, so you don't have to scramble around trying to find one. Make sure you have all three adaptive practices done. Chapter 12, 13, and 14 need to be completed by Thursday when you turn in the exam, in order to get the extra credit added to your Scantron when you turn it in. And make sure you get your chapter 14 assignment done, which is due tomorrow. Other than that, this will be the last day we really have for lecture. I will post your final review PowerPoint after we take the exam Thursday next week. So you'll have that to study over the holidays. But Thursday next week will be the last time I see you until the final. The final is scheduled, and the date is in Canvas already. Again, please note the time. It is at 10:30 start time, because that's the way that the final exams fall, because they're 2-hour blocks. The first exam is 8 to 10. Second exam starts at 10:30. So it's not our normal 11 o'clock time. So please make sure you take note of that so that you're there on time. I'll remind you of that next week, just to be sure. But that way, if you need to make arrangements with work or whatever, you have plenty of time to make an adjustment to that. Any questions before we get rolling? All right. So this is the fun part, lecturing to a bunch of gray blocks with names in them, and silence, which is, again, what I hate about this. But let me get the PowerPoint pulled up, and we'll get started on this. All right. Y'all are lucky I'm not like some instructors. Some instructors I know, they're like, oh, if my camera is going to be on, everybody else's camera is going to be on as well. So, but whatever. It's all in perspective. All right. So I think we left off last time. We had talked about cerebral spinal fluid. We had talked about cerebral spinal fluid, then we had talked about the blood-brain barrier. So we'll start off today talking about the different parts of the brain. We mentioned last class the three major regions or major parts of the brain, kind of as a whole. We talked about the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and the brainstem. And today, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of go into a little bit more detail regarding each of those individual parts of the gross anatomy of the brain. And where we're going to start is the brainstem. Brainstem is the inferior most part of the brain. It is going to consist of three different regions, the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. And each one of those regions is going to have a very specific job. The brainstem is going to be mostly comprised of white matter because most of what the brainstem is involved in is going to be communication, movement of signals and movement of information through it, either going to the brain in the cerebrum and the cerebellum or exiting that. There is some gray matter in there. We do have some nuclei located within the brainstem, which are going to be involved in some of our decision making and maintenance processes, but a large part of the function we're going to see associated with the different structures in the brainstem is going to be stuff that's actually kind of passing through it. And the first place we're going to see that is going to be in the medulla oblongata, which is the inferior most part of the brain. And it basically serves as kind of the gateway in and out of the brain from the spinal cord. All right. It is going to be our connection, obviously, to the spinal cord from the majority of our brain matter. So all of our ascending and descending tracts, meaning all sensory and all motor tracts, are going to pass through the gateway of the medulla oblongata. Now, there's also going to be some very important nuclei, which are going to be located in the medulla oblongata. Those nuclei are going to be related to cardiovascular and respiratory control. But one of the interesting things about the medulla oblongata is the descending tracts. The descending tracts, as they carry signals away from the brain, are actually going to cross over in the pyramids of the medulla oblongata. We call this crossing over of those motor tracts the desiccation of pyramids. What that ends up meaning is that the left side of the brain, or the left hemisphere of the brain, is ultimately responsible for the control over the right side muscles of the body. And the right side of the brain is in control over the left side muscles of the body. Meaning that if you are left-handed, you are most probably a little bit more dominant on the right side of your brain. And if you're right-handed, you're a little bit more dominant on the left side of your brain. And we'll talk a little bit more about that dominance and the lateralization that we see associated with that kind of at the end of this lecture. But the reason for that pattern, okay, of expression of the motor skills is going to be because of the crossing over of the tracts at this level of the brainstem. Now, we mentioned the other nuclei that were going to be important in there. These nuclei are related to cardiovascular and respiratory control. From a cardiovascular standpoint, these nuclei are going to control the rate of contraction of the heart, so basically your heartbeat, and they're going to control the force of contraction, as well as controlling the vasoconstriction, vasodilation of the blood vessels. So one of the main things that the cardiovascular centers are going to influence here is going to be blood pressure. Blood pressure is a relationship between vasoconstriction and dilation of the blood vessels, basically the size of the blood vessels, and the rate in which the heart contracts. Now, these cardiovascular centers do not tell the heart to actually beat. Right. So when we talk about heart rate, we're talking about it controlling the speed of contraction, but not actually initiating the contraction itself. The heart is autorhythmic. It has its own internal built-in pacemakers, which are going to fire off action potentials separate from the brain. The brain actually doesn't tell the heart to beat. The heart tells itself to beat. The brain just tells the heart how fast to beat and how strong to beat and how much force to beat with, with regards of, blood vessel size and things like that, which means for, kind of an interesting blueprint, that the heart can run without brain function. which is what we see oftentimes in patients that have, severe traumatic brain injuries. We'll see zero brain activity, but yet that person can continue to live if we keep them on life support. And that life support essentially is providing them oxygen, feeding tube, providing them nutrients, but it's not actually involved with providing electrical impulses to the heart. The heart will continue to provide its own electrical impulses as long as we provide it the nutrients needed in order to sustain those electrical impulses. So as long as the heart has, proper electrolyte balance, as long as the heart has ATP, as long as the heart has means of getting rid of waste products, then the heart itself and the tissue associated with the heart can continue to run. And a lot of the supporting tissue, okay, in the body is going to run based off of the body's ability to provide it nutrients. So as long as we breathe for the person and we give them the nutrients needed, and get rid of the waste products, then that heart itself can run for an extremely long time, even without any brain activity. Now, the other set of nuclei there are part of our respiratory centers of control. Now, when we talk about respiratory centers of control, yes, it's controlling the rate and the rhythm of breathing, but it's also allowing us to breathe. The diaphragm that controls breathing, we know, is not an involuntary muscle. We know that it's skeletal muscle. So we know that it's under involuntary control, but it doesn't have the ability to contract itself like the heart does. So it needs something from the brain that's going to initiate the signal that's going to allow it to contract. And those signals are going to come from the medulla oblongata, which is why we talked about, in the previous chapter, transections of the spinal cord at the base of the skull, resulting in fatality because it damages the brainstem. These are the centers of control that it damages, and this is why some type of injury sustained at the base of the skull can result in fatality because it destroys these respiratory rhythmic centers. Vomiting, coughing, sneezing, these are all reflexes that are going to be responded to or maintained in the medulla oblongata as well. And we're going to have 5 of our 12 cranial nerves come off the medulla oblongata. So you can see the medulla oblongata has got a whole lot going on because this is our entry point. We've got a lot of reflex centers there. We've got control over respiration. We've got control over cardiovascular control, and we've got almost half of our cranial nerves coming off of it. So it's interesting to me that the medulla oblongata exists outside of the cranial cavity because it's such an important piece of the brain that you would think that it would be very well protected in the cranial cavity. But for some reason, evolutionarily, it extends out. Now, the pons is going to be the area just superior to the medulla oblongata. So this area right here. The pons is going to sit basically anterior to our cerebellum, just in front of this space here, which is going to be our 4th ventricle. And the pons essentially is going to be a relay station that is going to allow the spinal cord to connect with the cerebellum and the cerebellum to connect to the cerebrum. So it's a bridge of communication from a lot of different major parts of the central nervous system. The cerebrum and the cerebellum are going to be very, very, they're going to work very closely together. The cerebrum as being our conscious control and the cerebellum being our unconscious control, but there has to be a lot of communication back and forth between that conscious and unconscious parts of our brain, and that's going to happen in this region of the brainstem that we call the pons. The midbrain is going to exist just superior to the pons. The midbrain has an anterior and a posterior portion. The anterior portion is going to contain motor tracts that we call the cerebral peduncles, kind of maintaining that concept of anterior being motor and posterior being sensory. We kind of see that play out with the midbrain, with the anterior portion being motor and the posterior portion being sensory functions. The posterior portion is going to be made up of a superior and an inferior colliculus. These colliculi are going to exist on each side of the posterior of the midbrain, and the posterior of the midbrain is going to be separated from the anterior mid of the midbrain by a channel that you can barely see kind of right through there, that is called the cerebral aqueduct. Now, the inside of the brain is going to consist of ventricles that we talked about last class. Those ventricles are going to be responsible for the beginnings of secretion of cerebral spinal fluid. You can actually see a left lateral ventricle here because the septum pellucidum has been removed. So our left lateral ventricle would be there. Our third ventricle essentially would be right in this area around the thalamus. Then we would have a connection between the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle, which is right here. And that connection is the cerebral aqueduct. From there, we see the cerebral spinal fluid would flow down and it would then enter into the central canal of the spinal cord. But this cerebral aqueduct kind of separates the anterior from posterior, and it connects the third and the fourth ventricles. Now, the cerebellum is located here posterior to the pons and the fourth ventricle. The cerebellum is made up of two separate hemispheres. Those hemispheres are going to join together at a structure by a structure called the vermis. And the cerebellum is going to be separated from the cerebrum via the transverse fissure, which is going to be this big fold right here between the cerebellum and the cerebrum. The transverse fissure is also where we're going to see a fold of the dura mater kind of compartmentalize these different parts of the brain. And that fold is what we call the tentorium cerebelli. Now, cerebellum is going to have like I said, it's going to have control over a lot of our unconscious thought. It's going to play a role in skeletal muscle contraction, but yet it's the skeletal muscle contraction that we don't control or that we don't think about controlling that the cerebellum is going to control. So think postural muscles, the muscles that are under constant contraction to hold your head up or to hold you up or to allow, shifting when we walk and things like that of our body weight and body position. Those are all going to be controlled by the cerebellum itself. The cerebellum is also going to help to smooth out these violent skeletal muscle contractions. Remember, skeletal muscle contractions work all or none. And so when we start recruiting these skeletal muscle fibers, it's really a violent contraction that takes place. And the cerebellum helps to smooth out those muscle contractions into the very, what I consider to be graceful movements that we can exhibit through muscular contraction. Cerebellum helps to hold us upright. Right, it's going to play a huge role in equilibrium and balance, which is why when you consume alcohol, your equilibrium and your balance is so severely affected because the cerebellum is going to be one of the parts of the brain that is very, very highly affected by alcohol intake. So when you start to drink alcohol, it's going to cause all of your synapses to start to depress, but it's going to greatly affect the neurons in the cerebellum, which is why we tend to see, the more we consume, the more our balance and our gracefulness seems to be off because of that cerebellar effect. Here's a picture of the vermis, okay, which is the connecting our left and right hemispheres. And there's a lot of gray matter and white matter associated with the cerebellum. If you go back to one of our diagrams, we'll see a diagram in just a few minutes where we can see the section of the cerebellum. You'll notice the huge amount of white matter that we have on the inside of the cerebellum and how if you kind of tilt your head a little to the side when you look at a cross section of the cerebellum, it kind of looks like a tree. All the white matter being the trunk and the branches of the tree. And we actually refer to that white matter, as the arbor vitae. And the gray matter that surrounds the white matter, okay, just like the leaves on the tree, we call the folia. So, they thought when they made a, mid-sagittal section on this, that's what it looked like. So they named it after tree parts. All kinds of great places you get names in the human body. All right, the diencephalon is going to be the area just superior to our brainstem. It's made up of three smaller areas, the hypothalamus, the thalamus, and the epithalamus. The diencephalon is the oldest, quote unquote, part of our brain. When I say old, we're talking about from an evolutionary standpoint. If you were to compare our diencephalon with just about any animal species, there really wouldn't be that big of a difference in the structure of the diencephalon and the way the diencephalon performs. Because the diencephalon is involved with some very rudimentary, very primitive, very instinctual survival type functions that all animal species exhibit. So if you compared our brain, okay, which is fairly new in terms of evolution, with the brain of a crocodile, okay, or a shark or something like that, that, some type of animal species that's been around for millions of years, you wouldn't see a whole lot of difference between the two. All right. Again, and that's just based on the function. There didn't need to be a lot of evolution there because the functions that those parts of the brain are providing are functions that every living thing needs. Now, what do these three different regions do? Well, the thalamus is going to be the largest part of the diencephalon, and it is a really important part because all sensory information, all sensory impulses from all over the body, except for smell, are going to pass through the thalamus. The thalamus kind of acts as a relay station, okay, or a router, all right, for all of this information. So we've got all of this data coming in from our lower extremities, all this data coming in from our upper extremities, all this data coming in from the abdominal and thoracic cavity, and it's all going to go to the thalamus. From the thalamus, it then gets routed out to the correct parts of the brain. So if we have, a taste coming in, it's going to go to the thalamus, and then the thalamus is going to send it out to the correct lobe of the brain for interpretation. If you have pain from your, right foot, it's going to go up the spinal cord and it's going to go to the thalamus, and then it's going to get routed out to the part of the cerebrum that deals with pain specifically for the right foot. All right. So it's the hub, okay, of all sensory information coming into the brain. There are also areas around the thalamus, okay, that we call limbic areas that are going to play a role in our emotional status, particularly emotions that are tied to memories. So when you think of an event that made you happy, okay, then it makes you happy now. If you think of an event that made you sad, or a smell that reminds you of some place or some time, that makes you happy or sad, that's all going to come from areas that are just surrounding the thalamic region of the diencephalon. A little bit posterior and inferior to the thalamus is an area called the epithalamus. And the primary constituent of the epithalamus is going to be the pineal gland, okay, which is this guy right here. The pineal gland is responsible for the secretion of melatonin. We know melatonin is related to sleep patterns, and melatonin is going to influence sleep by being released when it starts to get dark outside. When the sun starts to go down, our body is going to start to produce more melatonin. Photoreceptors in our eyes send a signal to that superior colliculus that I mentioned just a minute ago, which is right here. That superior colliculus is going to interpret that visual data. And when it determines that, hey, it's a little bit dark outside, that superior colliculus is going to send a signal to the pineal gland and say, hey, pineal gland, do your job, release melatonin, make Dr. B tired so he can get some rest while it's dark outside. As it starts to get light outside, well, guess what? We're going to start to decrease levels of melatonin. This is why you always feel so much more refreshed when you wake up on your own. All right. When you just wake up to the sunlight that's coming in your room on a Saturday morning at, say, 7 o'clock, you always feel a lot better than you do when your alarm goes off at 5 o'clock and it's dark outside. You say, even if you went to sleep 2 hours earlier so that you could get up at 5 o'clock, you're still going to be more groggy at 5 than you will be at 7. And that's because your levels of melatonin are still elevated because it's still dark outside. If you've ever worked a night job, you know that you struggle at the start of that because every night you're going to get tired until you've trained your body, okay, or you've forced your body to stay awake during that time when you're supposed to be asleep. I mean, look, folks, that's when people used to wake up. People used to wake up when the sun came up, and then they used to go to bed shortly after the sun went down. If the sun went down at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, they were typically, asleep shortly after that. I mean, look, why stay awake? You had no electricity, there was no TV, there was no internet, there was nothing to do. It was dark outside, you couldn't work. So you might as well go to sleep and rest up for your hard day of work, which was going to start as soon as the sun came up the next morning. All right. So our biological clocks, our internal circadian rhythm that goes up and down like this over the course of 24-hour period is driven by darkness and light. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're saying, well, Dr. B, I can just go get melatonin at CVS or at Walgreens, no problem. Yeah, that's true. Okay. And you can artificially take melatonin, and, it comes in all different, forms of, gummies or whatever. Okay. But remember, when you're taking something synthetically that your body naturally produces, if you're not in a deficient state, that could actually create a deficient state. Because why would your body continue to produce melatonin when it gets dark outside if you're taking melatonin to go to sleep at night, right? Now, is it bad for you to do it every now and then? No, of course not, because then your body can self-regulate. Okay, it can still produce its own melatonin because 5 nights out of the week you're producing your own, and 2 nights out of the week you're asking for a little bit of help. But it's when you switch that and you're going 5 nights or 6 nights a week taking melatonin, and you're only giving your body one night of rest. Well, typically that one night is not going to be a very good sleeping night. You're not going to have a very restful sleep because your body isn't going to produce the amount of melatonin it normally would, because it's going to be waiting for you to give it to it artificially. The other thing that really affects sleep patterns is light, okay, artificial light. Here we live in a world where artificial light surrounds us, and it really disrupts our normal sleep. Okay. If you're the type of person that likes to sleep with the TV on, you may think, oh, well, I sleep with the TV on because it helps me sleep better. I would argue against that all day long. It may help you fall asleep. My wife is ADD, and I don't say that in a negative way. I say that because she's diagnosed as that, and she would love to fall asleep with the TV on. But I can't fall asleep with the TV on. It makes me absolutely crazy. But it distracts her brain enough to allow her brain to shut down so she can go to sleep. The problem is that if you leave the TV on while you sleep, you won't get into as restful, deep sleep that you need to because of the artificial light flickering through your eyelids. You can see, if you close your eyes, you can see light through your eyelids. And so that artificial light flickering like that will disrupt the proper levels of melatonin secretion, and it'll disrupt your sleep pattern. Even though you think you're sleeping really good, you won't be as rested in the morning as you probably could. Okay, same thing goes for these things. Cell phones or iPads or whatever. When you're laying in bed and it's supposed to be dark and you have this screen lighting up your face like that, it is going to mess with your internal clock, and it is going to be harder for you to fall asleep. Question.
Will it be better if you like just have the TV on and have an eye cover or eyes cover?
What's the point? Yeah, I
Uh,
mean, like TV on
Prevent the
making
lights.
sound, like TV on with sound, or like she likes
Yeah,
the
just a
TV on
tiny, just a little bit of sound.
a little bit of sound. No, that would be better than having it on. See, when I say my wife likes the TV on, she just likes it on, like with no sound. She likes to have the flickering of the lights because it distracts her brain enough to allow her to go to sleep. She doesn't want noise. I would never, like, I am literally the person that I want my room to be like a cave. Like, I don't even have, my cable boxes have the little green light and the blue light on them to let me know that it's synced. Yeah, I have black electrician's tape over it because I don't want any light in my room whatsoever. I want complete darkness. The only sound can be the fans. That's it. And I fall asleep in usually about a minute, maybe a little bit longer. It just depends. But, I'm kind of like one of those dolls. You lay me down on the side and my eyes close and I'm out. My brain shuts off. I don't think about anything. Sleeping with the noise, but not having the light, that's different. That's a different scenario because you're not affecting your melatonin levels at that point because it's dark. So that's kind of more like white noise, which a lot of people sleep with that white noise, even though there's talking going on or whatever with the TV. If you can disconnect from that and not, be focused on what the words is that they're saying, just the sound itself, then no, that's not going to disrupt your melatonin levels the same way that having a muted TV would with the TV on, if that makes sense. All right. The hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is going to be located anterior and inferior to our thalamus. Hypo, less than, so lower than the thalamus. And the hypothalamus, it plays an important role in autonomic function. In fact, it basically controls the autonomic nervous system. It's going to produce hormones, which are going to have an effect on the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is located right here. It's basically the brain of the endocrine system. So it's going to control and coordinate functions between the nervous system and the endocrine system. We're going to regulate body temperature by blood that passes through the hypothalamus. Yes, this is your body's thermostat right here. This is where our body cares the most about what temperature our body is right here. Does it care about where it is, what the temperature is in your abdominal cavity? Yes. Does it care about what the temperature is in thoracic cavity? Yes. But why is it so specifically caring about what temperature it is in the deepest part of your brain? Well, because your brain is, number one, the body's most important organ. And number two, your brain is full of neurotransmitters. I mean, you have 100 billion neurons. Okay. That's just neurons. Each neuron has one axon, and who knows how many axon terminals and synaptic involves. So the volume of neurotransmitters that are being produced by the brain is just astronomical. Well, what type of molecule is a neurotransmitter? It's a protein. What do we know about proteins and heat? They don't like each other. They don't mix. So when body temperature gets elevated too much, that's going to denature proteins. Well, if we denature proteins in the brain, that's going to denature neurotransmitters, and that's going to decrease cranial brain function. All right. And when we see elevated body temperatures and we see people that are suffering from heat exhaustion or heat stroke or extreme high fevers and things like that, one of the first things they'll tell you about how they feel is they feel disoriented. Okay. They have a hard time stringing words together. Their train of thought gets wrecked. And that's because of the neurotransmitters getting disrupted because they're denaturing because of elevated temperature. So our body wants to make sure that it pays as close attention to body temperature here as it possibly can. All right, which is why the blood that passes through there, that's what sets the temperature for our entire body. That's why they say if you're cold, put a hat on. I mean, you can put a jacket on, you can put gloves on, but if your head is warm, a lot of times it can make the rest of you feel warm. Right? If your head is cold, it'll make the rest of you feel cold. Okay. And that's because of the blood that passes through the hypothalamus. The cerebral cortex is the biggest part of our brain. And again, like I mentioned last class, it is the part of the brain that really separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom. The things that we can do, all right, like read and write and speak and make plans and reason and have emotions and all this kind of stuff, that is mostly going to be driven from what comes in the cerebrum. And specifically is going to be divided out into the 4 different lobes based on what we're asking that part of the brain to do. They used to think that the brain was just this giant mass of neurons, just like this irregular collection of neurons that worked as a computer. But we started to figure out that the brain is actually mapped out fairly specifically. These lobes, the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobes, are all going to have very specific functions related to those lobes. And then we even see a little bit of a difference from the right and left hemispheres of these lobes. Some right hemispheres are going to be more prevalent to allowing us to express characteristics in one way, and some left hemispheres will be more prevalent to allow us to express characteristics in a different way. So it's not just this mass of neurons. And they figured this out actually after a gentleman named Phineas Gage sustained a pretty significant brain injury. Talked about it in my lab class yesterday. Phineas basically took a 2 to 3 foot piece of rod iron through his face and out the top of his skull. He worked on the railroad. There was an accident. There was an explosion that drove this piece of metal up through his face and out the top of his head, and he lived. but the frontal lobe of his brain was fairly well affected. Um, and basically, what happened with Phineas is over the years he changed. Okay, not even over the years, almost instantly he changed. He became a different person, and at that point, nobody really understood why. All right, they just thought something in him was different. And it wasn't until after he died and they started to study his brain that they started to figure out the differences that are located in these different parts of the brain. And now the frontal lobe, okay, which is our most highly evolved lobe, is going to have centers of control that are going to be very influential on, like we said, our higher executive orders of function. All right. Our ability to problem solve, our ability to put things together, our ability to rationalize, our ability to reason, our ability to make plans and sequence and organize. Okay, those all come from the frontal lobe. Our personality comes from our frontal lobe. And that's what people noticed about Phineas more than anything else, was that his personality changed. He changed. He wasn't the same guy. Right. Before his accident, he was a good husband, a good worker, a good friend, a good father. He went to church, whatever. All right. After it, he was a wild man. All right. He was cheating on his wife. He didn't care about his kids. He got fired from all these different jobs. He was just a hoodlum. He's just all over the place. And people didn't understand what caused him to be that way. But it wasn't his fault. He didn't try to make it happen. It happened because he essentially lobotomized himself. Okay. The accident lobotomized him. All right. You may have heard of lobotomies. They used to give lobotomies to patients in psychiatric wards, people that had, multiple personality disorders and things like that. They would do a lobotomy on them. Well, a lobotomy basically means we're going to take out a lobe or a part of a lobe of your brain. And they were able to do this because they figured out which lobes of the brain controlled which functions. And they figured, hey, if a person has a personality disorder, let's remove the part of the brain that gives them personality. And then they won't have 20 personalities, they'll actually have zero. And we see this a lot of times in patients that have dementia, patients that have neurological diseases that affect the frontal lobe of the brain. I talked about this in lab yesterday. My dad had dementia. He suffered with dementia for about 10 years. And about 2 years into his diagnosis, he changed. He was a completely different person. And he went from being, one of the sweetest, most helpful, most hands-on, people that you could ever be around to, a pretty big asshole. And I don't say that in a way that it was his fault, because it was the disease that changed who he was. But my dad never had a crossword from my mom ever. Did I ever hear him talk down to her or ugly to her? And he changed, and he cursed at her almost every day. Disrespected her, gave her the bird, all this kind of stuff. And it was hard for my mom to understand what was happening and why he was behaving that way. I had to keep reminding her that, hey, it's not him, it's who he's becoming. His brain is basically just rewiring itself in a way that we're not familiar with. But it's not of his choosing. And that's something to keep in mind, as you start working with patients that have situations like that. It's really hard for the caregivers to wrap their brain around, this person isn't the same person. It took a long time for my mom to realize that the man she was married to now was not the man that she married 50 years ago. It was a different person. So it's hard. It's really hard to understand that you can see that type of thing expressed so much because of the neurological changes that affect the brain. But we can see it with speech patterns. You can see it with taste patterns. You can see it with movement patterns. Anything the brain controls, if we rewire it a different way, it's going to change the way then that function, whatever it may be, memory, ability to speak, whatever, the way that function is expressed. On the surface of the brain, we have all of these ridges of brain matter that we call gyri, and we have all of these depressions between the ridges that we call sulci. There is a primary sulcus that separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobes that we call the central sulcus. And on either side of that, we have a very prominent ridge of brain matter. This would be the precentral gyrus, okay? And then this would be the postcentral gyrus. Notice they're on different lobes of the brain. The precentral gyrus in front of the central sulcus is going to be the primary place that we have somatomotor function, right? So the motor control that we have over our skeletal muscles is going to originate from the precentral gyrus. The postcentral gyrus is going to be where most of that sensory information, the somatosensory information from our body, comes into to help control the somatic response that we have going from the precentral gyrus, which again kind of follows that same theme of sensory in the back and motor out of the front. And we're talking about back and front compared to the central sulcus here. Sensory is postcentral, motor is precentral. Just like sensory goes in the back, motor goes out the front. Now, obviously, there's a lot of white matter deep on the inside of the cerebrum, and this white matter is there for communication purposes. The gray matter that surrounds the outside of the brain is the thinking part of our brain. That's where all the nuclei are going to be located that we use for decision making. But we then need to be able to communicate all of these different parts of the brain to integrate together so that we can function, in the outward presentation, the outward way that we do. So what we have are these myelinated white tracts, which are going to carry signals in different directions within the brain. Association tracts, they're going to conduct nerve impulses between gyri within the same hemisphere. All right, so if I got my right hemisphere, left hemisphere, association tracts are just going to stay in this right hemisphere. And a lot of times they're running from front to back. Commissural tracts are going to run from left to right or from right to left. Okay, they're going to run back and forth. Okay, remember when we looked at the cross section of the spinal cord, we had the gray commissure, okay, connecting the gray matter on the right side to the gray matter on the left side. The commissural tracts are going to connect left and right. And then projection tracts are going to convey impulses from the lower parts of the central nervous system to higher parts, or from higher parts to lower parts. Now we can see this on this diagram. All right. Notice these tracks here running from high to low, low to high. Okay, those would be our projection tracks. Notice these tracks here running kind of from front to back. Those would be our association tracks. And then these tracks that we actually have cut in half, these would be commissural tracks. So they're running across from left to right. This commissural tract right here is the largest, and that is the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is going to be one of the main bands of axons that connects the left and right hemispheres. Ironically enough, the corpus callosum was an answer on Jeopardy yesterday. Yes, I watch Jeopardy, okay, every day. I learn stuff from Jeopardy all the time. So the corpus callosum, there was a whole category on anatomy words that begin with the letter C. So I got them all right, thankfully. I'd have been embarrassed if I hadn't. But corpus callosum wasn't one of the answers. Although the contestant said corpus callosum, and they actually didn't give it to her. They actually went back and took it away from her because she added a T into it. So it's callosum. They even mispronounced it on there because they said colossum, and it's not. It's callosum. So they should double check that before they start speaking. Anyway, important structure that allows for communication left and right. Why is it important to have communication left and right? Because the left and right hemispheres aren't exactly the same. They look the same on the outside. They're mostly laid out the same, but there is a little bit of difference between the two in the way that those two hemispheres behave. This hemispheric lateralization is going to differ between one person and the next, and it's really not a set in stone blueprint. But we do find it to be true in people that are very, very heavily handed on one side or the other, meaning, oh, I am absolutely right-handed, I can't do anything left-handed, or I am 100% left-handed, I can't do anything right-handed. That's where we see it most pronounced, okay? And we do see it most pronounced really severely, more in women than men. What hemispheric lateralization means is that you, okay, most people are going to be one hand dominant. meaning you're going to be right-handed or you're going to be left-handed. Now, some people are ambidextrous. They can do a little bit with both hands, but they're still going to probably have one hand that they prefer. Or some people have, that they use this hand for these things, and then they use this another hand for something else. Like my son is right-handed. He writes right-handed, throws a ball right-handed, but he swings a golf club, swings a baseball bat, everything left-handed. I didn't teach him that. It's just the way he picked it up, and that's the way that he goes. I, on the other hand, am very, very dominant right-handed. There's very few things that I can do left-handed, which means that I am mostly a left hemisphere person. Because remember, we have the desiccation of the pyramids in the medulla oblongata, which means if I'm heavily right side dominant, then I'm going to be heavily left brain dominant as well. If you're left-handed, you're heavily right brain. Now, what we see with this is that the left hemisphere is going to have more features controlling that express characteristics based on reasoning or numerical skills or scientific skills or the ability to understand and use sign language, okay, things like that. Whereas right hemisphere people or left-handed people, left side dominant people, will be more artistically and musically inclined. Maybe they can recognize patterns more easily. Maybe they have the ability to discriminate between different smells and tastes a little bit more a refined palate than people that are right-handed. Now, the majority of the population is right-handed. All right, the percentage of people that are left-handed is really, really small. If we were in class, I'd have everybody raise their hand. Oh, who's left-handed? And we might have one or two people that are left-handed in the class. And maybe those left-handed people might be a little bit more artistically inclined. Maybe they paint, maybe they draw, maybe they do digital design, maybe they like to cook really well. And I'm not saying that right-handed people can't do those things. And I'm not saying left-handed people can't reason and do science and math. I'm just saying that we see a prevalence increased for those type of activities based on the dominant side of your brain. I started noticing this, when I remember reading about this, when I was in college, and I started paying attention to this when there were situations where I could really pay attention to it, like on TV, like watching TV programs or movies or watching, award shows. Award shows are a great place to see this, right? Because people come up and they accept their award and they either grab it left-handed or right-handed. And you can see they're wearing their watch on a left hand or a right hand, or they're signing autographs left-handed or right-handed. So you can tell, whether that person is left-handed or right-handed. And you'll notice if you watch that stuff, there is a much higher percentage than the general population of left-handed people in show business, in music, okay, than there are in the general population. I don't know what the numbers are. I don't know what the percentage of left-handed people are in the general population. But I guarantee you, in the entertainment industry, it's a higher percentage, a significantly higher percentage than the general population. And probably if you went into science labs and you did the same type of research, you would probably find much fewer left-handed people than the general population in science labs, okay? And look, I'm a great example of this because I'm so heavily right-handed and I have absolutely zero musical abilities, zero artistic ability. Okay. I don't do puzzles. I'm not good at pattern recognition. Okay. I mean, I'm not going to be like an interior designer or design clothes or any of that kind of stuff because it just doesn't come naturally to me. Could I teach myself? Could I learn to do it? Yes. All right. But could I do it just as easily, as somebody who is left-handed? Probably not. It's going to come more natural to them than it is to somebody like me. Just like somebody who's heavily left-handed might see, might struggle with math and science. Okay, they might not have, very logical deductive reasoning or something like that. Again, it's not set in stone, but it's just really something interesting to think about and maybe to notice in yourself. Like I said, my son does a little bit of both. And so he kind of is in the middle of these things. He has, the ability he's pretty good at science and math. He's not terrible, but he's, very artistic. I mean, that's his job. He's in media, and so he does graphic design and all that kind of stuff, self-taught. I didn't show him any of that, surely, because I can't do any of it. But I think that comes from just having a little bit of that right brainness that allows him to be able to accomplish some things left-handed, that he kind of fits in the middle of it. But just interesting for you to kind of note as you watch people, you can kind of see this pattern develop. All right, and that gets us to cranial nerves, which is the last thing in chapter 14. Now, this is a really great diagram. Okay, it's pretty simple, easy, clear to see, that shows you the 12 cranial nerves. Now, I won't use this diagram on the exam, but this is a great diagram for you to help you use to help you identify for the models in lab, because it's pretty straightforward with showing you cranial nerve 1 all the way down to cranial nerve 12. And it gives you the list of the cranial nerves and the numbers associated with it. Now, on the practical, that's how I'll ask, or on our exam, that's how I'll ask you questions. I might say, oh, at the abducens nerve is cranial nerve what? And you've got to know the number of it. Or I might say cranial nerve 9 is which nerve? And you've got to tell me which nerve cranial nerve 9 is. You got to be able to match the number to the name. But then you also need to be able to give me the function of that particular cranial nerve. All right, so I won't give you a picture and ask you to identify it there. That's going to be in lab. But you do need to know all the functions for those cranial nerves, and you need to be able to match up the name and the number. Now, this picture shows it to where it appears that the cranial nerves run from anterior to posterior. It's a two-dimensional picture, so that's how it's going to look. But in reality, cranial nerves run from superior to inferior. That's why I have this picture in here, because this is probably one of the most impressive dissections that I have ever seen of the human head. Because yes, that is actually a human head. Okay, that was a cadaver head that they transversely sectioned, and then they cut a big chunk of the brain out right here. And the person came in and this hand dissected out all of the individual cranial nerves as they come off of the different parts of the brain. So you can see all these cranial nerves that come off down here, off the medulla oblongata, like we talked about. Okay, then we move up into the pons. We get up. Here's our diencephalon. This is actually the inferior part of the corpus callosum. All right, here's where cranial nerve 2 is going to attach. So you can see the detail there and how those cranial nerves come off, which that I think actually will help you just as much in lab as the other diagram will, because when you're looking at the model in lab, it's going to be in 3D. So let's go through our cranial nerves. Cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory nerve, and that is the nerve we use for a sense of smell. Now, how the olfactory nerve is positioned actually is related to the skeletal system. If you remember in the skeletal system, in lab, and the anterior part of the inside of the skull, you had a structure called the crista galli, and then just behind that, you had the cribriform plate. In that cribriform plate, you had openings that we called olfactory foramen. Those olfactory foramen are where we are going to have axons that come from the olfactory bulb of the olfactory nerve. We extend this tract out and have this little bulb sitting right here on the cribriform plate. And they're going to be axons that come down and permeate into our bipolar neurons that have dendrites that extend out to the nasal mucosal lining. So as we gather up information, we send those up through those axons to the olfactory nerve along the olfactory tract, and we connect right here near the hypothalamus. Cranial nerve 2, optic nerve, the only cranial nerve that crosses over its sensory receptors to the other side of the brain. Right? All of our other cranial nerves are going to stay on the same side of the brain in which they originate. Motor function, sensory function, everything stays on the same side, except vision. Your right eye, interpreted by the left side of your brain. Your left eye, interpreted by the right side of your brain. All right. But that's going to happen via the optic nerve. Cranial nerve 3 is the oculomotor nerve. Cranial nerve 4 is the trochlear nerve, and cranial nerve 6 is the abducens nerve. And these three nerves, cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6, make our eyes do tricks. All right, these are the cranial nerves that are responsible for movement of the eye. Now, cranial nerve 3 is going to supply motor function to 4 of our 6 extraocular muscles: superior rectus, inferior rectus, medial rectus, and inferior oblique. The trochlear nerve, cranial nerve 4, has one job: control the superior oblique muscle. Cranial nerve 6 has one job: control the lateral rectus muscle. Now, cranial nerve 3 is also going to be responsible for eyelid input, motor input to our eyelids, and for pupillary constriction and dilation. Cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal nerve. Trigeminal nerve is the major sensory nerve to our face, but trigeminal nerve also has some motor function because it does control the masseter. So essentially, all sensory input from the face via 3 branches, that's why it's called the trigeminal nerve: the ophthalmic branch, the maxillary branch, and the mandibular branch. Those 3 branches are carrying information back about pain, touch, tickle, temperature, everything from the sides of our face. All right. And then we get motor function coming back from the mandibular branch that goes to the muscle, or to the masseter muscle, which is going to help us to elevate the jaw or chew. Cranial nerve 7, remember we did 6 already. So cranial nerve 7 is the facial nerve. This is going to be the nerve that innervates all the rest of the muscles of the face. However, it also has sensory function in that it brings taste sensations back from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. Now, any damage or any irritation to the facial nerve can result in loss of motor function on that side of the face. Any disruption or loss of motor function on one side of the face we call Bell's palsy. And Bell's palsy is one of those things where it just kind of happens and comes out of nowhere. Sometimes it can be stress driven, but most of the time in most patients that have it, it just kind of comes up on its own and it goes away on its own as well. Cranial nerve 8, the vestibulocochlear nerve. Vestibulocochlear nerve has 2 parts. It used to just be called the auditory nerve, but it's got its name changed because it's not just responsible for hearing. The cochlear portion is responsible for our hearing portion of the inner ear, but the vestibular portion is responsible for our balance portion of the inner ear. As you look at this model of the inner ear, you see the little snail shell portion. That's the cochlea, that's the hearing part. You see these semicircular canals over here. That's the vestibule, that's our balance part. Those 2 nerves merge together right there, and they form the vestibulocochlear nerve. Cranial nerve 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve. Now, the glossopharyngeal nerve is going to carry taste from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, but it's also going to contain baroreceptors located in the carotid body and the carotid sinuses. These are going to measure blood pressure as it enters into the brain. We want to make sure that that is the perfect blood pressure for delivering that 20% of nutrients that we need to the brain. So any decrease in pressure at that point will result in us passing out. Because as we're pumping blood, we're obviously pumping it up to the brain against gravity. And one way we can eliminate gravity is to lay ourselves down flat. So any decrease in pressure here will cause us then to do this so that blood can get to the brain. But that's a function of cranial nerve 9, is to monitor that pressure. Also, autonomic nervous system impulses to the salivary glands, like the parotid gland, like the sublingual and submandibular gland. They're going to be controlled by the glossopharyngeal nerve, and it does help to initiate swallowing as well. Cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve, which is nicknamed the wanderer. Why is it called the wanderer? Because it goes all over the thoracic and the abdominal cavities. All right. It carries parasympathetic motor signals, and it carries some visceral sensory signals back to and from the brain. It doesn't necessarily have control over those specifically. It just depends on the autonomic signals that it's carrying, but it's going to travel all over the abdominal thoracic region, which again lends to its name, the Wanderer. Cranial nerve 11, the spinal accessory, or you'll sometimes just hear it called the accessory nerve. It is controlling motor function to two sets of muscles, the trapezius muscle and the sternocleidomastoid muscle. And then one of the biggest cranial nerves in the body is cranial nerve 12, which is the hypoglossal nerve. Why is the hypoglossal nerve so big? Because your tongue is probably one of the most impressive muscles that we have in the body. Not necessarily from a strength standpoint, but from a control standpoint. Lots of very high precision motor units traveling to the tongue because we ask the tongue to do a whole lot of things during the course of the day, and yet we still manage to keep it safe from harm. I mean, we chew, we talk, we swallow, we do all of these things, sometimes multiple things at the same time. We're constantly manipulating our tongue for sound purposes when we speak, and yet we are able to do all of that, not bite it for the most part on a regular basis, because we have such very precise control over our tongue. But that's all it does. Hypoglossal motor control over the tongue. And that is it. That is chapter 14. In fact, that is it as far as lecture material goes. Any questions on chapter 14? Any questions with anything coming up in the next week?
We'll review on Tuesday.
We'll review on Tuesday, so come with questions. Exam Thursday. And then after that, I won't see you till the final. All right. Well, hopefully weather issues are going to be done. We won't have to do this again, I hope. So some of you I will see in lab on Monday. The rest of you I will see on campus on Tuesday. Y'all have a great weekend. I will post this onto Canvas in just a little while as soon as Zoom gets it to me and I can get it downloaded and re-uploaded. But otherwise, y'all have a great weekend. I'll see y'all next week.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
See y'all later.